Hello everyone, welcome again to this episode of the Green Living Chats podcasts. In this episode, we continue our discussions with Isak Stoddard on why we haven't been able to bend the global emissions curve after 30 years of climate mitigation. Here, Isak guides us to explore this question through 9 different lenses. And the surprising find that their paper makes is that there is a common thread, which is the central role of power through all these different lenses. We hope that you enjoy this episode and that you also find your individual role in dealing with the global emissions curve, no matter how small it may be. Here we go. So, again, coming back to the topic, I guess you touched on it. You partly mentioned why we haven't been able to do this. But, and again, in the paper when I was reading, and I think that, well, it wasn't a surprise to me, but I'm sure that anyone who is not in our field would be quite surprised to see that. And I really loved the first figure that you had over there. I'm going to try to sort of read it out because it's there's a lot over there. I mean, in the figure, you are showing the evolution of CO2 emissions. At least one of the figures, you're showing the evolution of CO2 emissions since the mid-90s to the current time, to present time. And then you show, the efforts that we've been making, to actually bend this, since 1988, of the first IPCC report, the UNFCCC establishment, the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, and yet we still see the emissions going up. And I guess the question that you asked in the paper is also the question that will be on everyone's mind. Why? We would think that with all these things coming up, something would change. Or do you think, one would also ask that, do you think because we had these things in place, probably, I mean, we didn't get to the worst case scenario, but, what's your thought on that? Looking at the 9 themes that you used, could you sort of, I know it's a big question, but could you sort of walk us through why all these measures that we have been taking haven't met the goal, I think?
Well, I guess it's a huge challenge, and I'll do my best. I guess because I've noticed when I've been trying to speak about this paper that it is hard to summarize in many ways because it's quite dense and it touches upon a lot of different set of issues. So I still haven't figured out the best way to speak about it. So this is still an experiment to trying to find ways of doing that. Yeah.
And we have people on both sides. We have those who just want to know, okay, so just tell us what is it, and then there are also those who really want to know what's going on, what's going on in between the lines over there. So your response would definitely reach these 2 groups of people,
Yeah. That's great. I mean, the figure that you referred to earlier with the green, it's focusing on carbon emissions, and it's starting from 1960, I think, going on today. And then we have all these different things that happen, and also that are attempts to sort of deal with this rise in emissions. I guess what one can note there is that there's a small dip in the graph. One is at the financial crisis, so-called financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and then the second dip, which isn't really covered in the graph, but it's connected to the last 2 years and what's been going on. So, and we can get back to that as well, I guess, because I think there's some important discussions to be had about that. But just very briefly then, and the other thing that we really touch upon in that graph is to try to show the unequal distribution of where these greenhouse gases or where carbon comes from, basically. So the inequity surrounding this, and that most of these emissions have come from a quite small portion of the world population in the wealthier industrialized part of the world. And that's also where many of the co-authors of this paper reside. So we sort of it's easier to, and it's more important to critique yourself, both based on the numbers, but also being based in those countries. We need to sort of, point the criticism towards ourselves before criticizing anybody else for doing anything. So I think that's an important, and there's no real reason to criticize, the people that haven't contributed to the problem either. So, but anyways, I think the nine lenses, just to run through them really quickly. I think I'm going to try something new here and just mention them.
Yeah.
And then I'll go back to them. So the 9 thematic lenses that we looked into were international climate governance, the vested interests of the fossil fuel industry, geopolitics and militarism, economics and financialization, climate mitigation modeling, so climate modeling, how to decrease emissions, energy systems, inequity, high carbon lifestyles, and social imaginaries, which is a kind of a complicated term, but you could translate it to collective visions of how we might live in the future. These were the 9 different thematic entry points, and them in themselves are interdisciplinary, but they draw upon different sets of literatures also. I guess, as I said earlier, when we had gotten these contributions in from the co-authors that were writing this with us, we then tried to weave a narrative out of these 9 different entry points. And after much iteration, we saw this common theme of power come out in different forms, and we grouped them into clusters. So I thought maybe I could just sort of touch upon these different forms of power that we found, and then also bring up some examples from the different thematic areas in connection to that, if that makes sense, maybe.
Yeah.
So we also made use of caricatures, which is maybe not so common within certain fields of research. But the first set of power, we found that it was important also to paint sort of to get a sense of, not only say that there's, for example, in the first group of themes, that we identified sort of incumbent, raw, institutionalized forms of power that's usually top down and usually hidden and not really well understood. And we could have said it that, but we captured that in the idea of that this is the Davos mentality, or the Davos cluster. And for those of you who don't know what Davos refers to, it's the place where the World Economic Forum happens every year, which gathers sort of financial, political, economic elites to discuss various issues. And we see that this is kind of symptomatic and epitomizes some of the forms of power that we think are very much more in the way than actually being part of being able to respond adequately to climate change and the broader sustainability crisis. And this is manifest in different places. So for example, in the negotiations, you have state power, you have the power of the nation state playing out against each other, and the various things behind that. Of course, a lot of, for example, the fossil fuel industry, which is another thing we looked into. It's important to note that is both private, but also public. So a lot of fossil fuel companies are, of course, owned by nation states as well. So they go into each other in all sorts of different ways. And when it comes to the fossil fuel industry and the sort of incumbent interests of that, I think it's interesting also to note that we've seen a shift from sort of a lot of fossil fuel companies funding, let's say, think tanks that spread different kinds of information that sheds doubt on the science of climate change, to becoming much more common to see that oil and gas majors are sort of framing their operations as part of the solution and delivering on the Agenda 2030 and sort of reaching net zero emissions and so forth. So we try to sort of punch a hole in that sort of rhetorical shift, and we'll see, also how that plays out. But I think it's an interesting shift. And then the last thing that underpins, I guess, both corporate and state forms of power is a long-standing sort of the geopolitical and also the military interests that go way back in time. And of course, you can draw this all the way back, and also not only those interests, but also the sort of mindsets and practices that go back hundreds of years, for example, through colonialism. And of course, that have then found new expressions in the post-World War era, where we've seen an expanded globalization, increased competition for resources, sort of extractive mindset, continuing to extract resources from countries that are usually poor and transporting them to richer countries. And this is actually interesting because this is actually something that I would like to write more about in the future, because this is actually increasingly driven also by the need to decarbonize. So rare earth minerals, for example, and so forth for renewable technologies. So this is something.
I'm not sure if you have come across this research while I was sort of reading your paper. Another one that I was also looking at because of the paper that I'm writing was one that was published by a group in ETH Zurich. It's called Responsibility of Major Emitters for Country Level Global Warming and Extreme Hot Years. You'll be amazed that you guys, their figure one and your figure one, it was just so much alike, what they were saying, the points that they were raising of the inequities in unequal distributions or unequal emissions, which was also something that Origin touched on during the climate finance talk as well. It's such a real problem, and I think that it's really feeds back into your final conclusion, because now we have the underdeveloped or some developing countries crying out saying it's time for us to emit. I don't agree, but it's sort of like this has become what justice looks like, and it's not a pretty sign. I think it's there's still that power play still going on. Well, you did all your emissions for all these years. Now allow us to do that, and I think what you might be actually interested in knowing is that I have had people, or at least when I was a PhD student, I had students my age saying the same thing, and I was like, well, oh my, these are future leaders, and if this is what they are saying now, they are saying that it's our time to pollute the environment so that we get better. I don't know what kind of betterment that is being referred to, but it's a huge problem, and I think you guys were right on the money with those conclusions over there. So this is just what I wanted to chip in.
No, that's great to hear, and I think it's important to also take those statements that you're talking about very seriously, and I think they are legitimate in many ways. I think it's that's not to say, but you have to sort of course, zoom out a little bit and also see it as sort of, what sort of development trajectories and forms of life are meaningful and lead to happiness, and not only happiness, but also to livelihoods and situations where one can flourish in various ways. And I think, but it's very hard for me, coming from Sweden, a wealthy industrialized country that has, been built on emitting a lot of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions and destroying a lot of our nature, but also in other parts of the world, to say anything critical of other countries that at the moment. So from my perspective, that's very hard to do. Point fingers when we are not ourselves willing to rethink our development trajectories. That's where personally, that's where I have to start, and to see what we can do from where we are. But yeah, it's still, it's a very broad and very difficult question, of course. But just to quickly go into the other thematic areas that we touched upon, a second cluster of themes that we call the enabler cluster, forms of power that were found in these analysis, was one where knowledge can be more or less equated to power, or knowledge production is created to power. So, and so far, I think way too much research at the moment has either directly or indirectly been enabling the powers and decrees coming from the Davos cluster and allowing them to continue rather than challenging them, or also supporting other forms of futures that are not coming from the top down. And the three examples that we go into in this cluster is the knowledge production connected to economics and its sort of practical implementation in the financialization of almost everything nowadays. I would have some interesting discussions, I think, with your previous guest also on this, because I thought it was very interesting to get his perspective on this. What we go into in our paper is more a critique of the idea of financialization as a reasonable response to the situation we find ourselves in. But of course, you need to nuance that critique. We go into the assumptions underpinning a lot of the modeling that takes place within the IPCC's third working group, and the underlying assumptions about what the future may bring about, and the sort of the very high reliance on technological solutions that don't exist today, but that are in the future seem to hopefully be able to suck greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere in a technical means, rather than working with the brilliant forms of natural ways of doing that already. For example, the trees that we have around us. And the third thing we look into there as an example also of how knowledge production shapes the future is the energy system and the assumptions about energy, and how we've seen so far, renewable energy, for example, only being added on top of fossil fuel energy that we have today. So it hasn't, on a global level, we haven't seen a substitution between the two. And this goes back to one of your previous discussions, I think, on your podcast, also with Professor Madhavi Venkatesan as well, where she talks about the importance of also looking at the total amount of energy that we use, and how quickly we've reached energy levels on a global level, particularly in wealthy industrialized countries that are completely at odds with our with our natural ecological systems, but also with historical precedent. And I guess just to get us through this, the last set of themes that we looked at could be clustered into what we call in the paper the ostrich and phoenix cluster. So here we really focus on the power of ideas and the power of the example. So and the ostrich is a reference. I don't think actually ostriches do this, but there is a saying, of course, that you stick your head in the sand to not wanting to see what's actually going on. So a lot of ignoring a lot of things that's happening around you. So that's the kind of reference to the ostrich. And the phoenix is kind of, in a sense, set in opposition to this, is the mythological bird that is known as the phoenix, which is born out of the ashes of its predecessor. So it's the predecessor goes into ash, and then a new phoenix is born out of it. So it's the idea of sort of image of transformation, which I guess also lies in social change. It's providing new ideas, and also to doing things differently is really important in this. And we look at questions of inequity that we touched upon already earlier there. We look at the particularly high carbon lifestyles of a very small percentage of the world population that is contributing a huge amount of the greenhouse gas emissions that we're seeing, and also try to set behavioral aspects sort of coming out of psychology next to other more complex descriptions of how behaviors are embedded in structures in our societies and how they reproduce certain behaviors and so forth through social practice theory is the field that's known through. And then the last final lens is sort of the lens that kind of tries to underpin and comment on all the previous lenses, because it's this lens of social imaginaries that I spoken about, or that I mentioned in the beginning, and that there's been a sort of, so again, that's kind of, it can be understood as collective visions of how we might live. And this underpins almost all of the other lenses that I talked about before. And there's a sort of, what we noted here in this piece is the ignorance and sort of active marginalization of these imaginaries that would see beyond the form of industrial modernity. So this connects to questions of also philosophy, sort of, ontology, what the world may be, and also epistemology, how do we come to know what the world may be or is, and how is this reflected in our cultures and institutions, and that includes educational and research institutions. So we also criticize, the universities that we tend to spend a lot of our times in as well, and in this piece as well. So it's sort of a massive critique, I guess, of almost everything. But I also realized that in the writing of this paper, that there are also limits of critique. And there's a risk sometimes when you critique something, and when you say that this is the problem and these are the power structures that we need to change, that you actually risk lending support to them and strengthening them by critiquing them. So that's sort of where I think it's important to critique them, but I think it's also then important to step back and think about, well, how can things be done differently then? To not get stuck in sort of just pointing fingers and saying this is what's wrong with the world, but actually, living and doing things in ways that then go in a different direction. Yeah, that's that was a very good conclusion, because I think it's more difficult to see what we are not doing to get this done. I am in the modeling community. One of the things that we are doing is that we're looking at different scenarios of emissions
in the next 100 years. But then you find that, out of them, it's just one of the projections that focus on regional rivalries, which I think it's probably where we are heading towards. We are heading towards this sort of regional rivalries, different places, trying to claim what is theirs, and trying to ask for their portion to do whatever it is. Because of course, everyone wants to develop, and it will be very unfortunate for any region that they're not able to keep up with the development of the other countries, because it would mean that they will lose a lot, even on very basic things like food and energy and water for their people as the world changes very drastically. I'm hoping that everyone listening would sort of, within each theme, find that everyone has a calling in each theme, and that it's not something left for a specific group of people to do, because whether we like it or not, other places that may not have developed have also sort of in a way benefited from the development of the developed countries here and there, and so we share in our success, and we also share in our failures. And I think that it would be the difficulty would be trying to get everyone to recognize that we all have a role to play, and we have to all do it this way. Can we visit the dips that you mentioned earlier on? We had the financial crisis, and then the COVID. At least for the COVID, I'm very much aware of the research going on and how that has affected emissions. There's a lot of research being published in that respect. So I think there are lessons to be learned there, right?
Hi there, just a quick one. If you find our conversations worth listening, why don't you share them with your friends and connections? Please help us reach more and new listeners by leaving a review, commenting, or rating us on any platform where you get your podcast. We can't wait to hear your thoughts and ideas, so share them with us via a social media platform or email. Find more details in the show notes. Now let's get back into today's conversation.
For me, I think the more important question is, are there realistic lessons that we could be learning? Because I was sort of making a joke with my friends, saying that my wife and I want to visit our families, but in a way it's also a way of saying, we want to pollute more. Because we're going to take flights, and so are there some lessons that we can learn from these events?
Yeah, I mean, starting where you with your own story there, I guess, Daniel, it's interesting. I mean, I've been reading some people that have been sort of making that argument that this brings us down to the ground in a very physical sense, and to the places we're in. Yeah. The problem I see, at least in my own life and people around us, it brings us down to the ground, but then it brings us in front of the screen. And I really appreciate being able to talk to you, even though you're in China. So there's of course advantages with this reality, and we're developing this way of interacting as well in many ways. But I also see the backside of that. And I guess I'm just to say, before I respond to your bigger question here in connection to COVID, I mean, I can only speak for what I've learned in this process. I think these issues are there, and they're hard also to grasp a little bit what's actually going on. And when it comes to a situation such as this, that is a form of crisis or an emergency. And I'm not sure I'm done thinking about this, but here are some sort of preliminary reflections, I guess, from my side as well. And I think in the early days of 2020, after few weeks after our government started taking measures here in Sweden, I had some optimism, because there was a lot of images floating around of sort of emissions going down, cleaner water, wildlife returning to habitats that they had fled from before. So you could see these kind of these things, and I saw, this shows something, and I felt sort of an optimism around that at first. But then, of course, if we looked at what has happened after that in terms of emissions, of course, now we're seeing a kickback that seems like it's almost, it's kind of kicking back into gear. And the so-called recovery, I'm afraid we'll get things back on a very unsustainable track that it was on before. So it is a sort of dip rather than something that we've learned something from in that regard. And we're also then seeing a rhetoric around sort of coming back to a new normal or building back better. And, now there's our chance to sort of drive the fourth industrial revolution, and Davos, to refer back to them, they're talking about the great reset and all these sort of things. And this sort of framing, to me, that's kind of chills my bones, actually, in many ways, because I think that's exactly how we got into this mess in the beginning. And now there's more of that kind of coming our way. So I think in the later stage of the pandemic now, and now, of course, we're coming out of it. And people are sort of, going back to normal, at least here in Sweden, more or less, the restrictions are being lifted and so forth. But I think it's important to reflect back and think about this. And this might be very different in different parts of the world, and it will be experienced differently by different people. And for me, this speaks to sort of a problem what happens when we end up in a sort of an emergency, is that suddenly our gazes can become very narrow. And we only focus on one particular metric. So we become reductionist, and there's a sort of a narrow mindset that also shuts down important public discussions about sort of the values that perhaps should have guided the very difficult situation that the virus has sort of put us in. So it's and that this kind of discussion, and I think this maybe has taken place in certain places, but I feel, at least personally in Sweden, this didn't really take place. So that's some sort of some critical reflections on what what I see is the risk of the 2 years that we've been in, and also what that can lead to in the extension when thinking about other sort of very real situations of crisis, such as the ecological crisis and climate change. I can point maybe the listeners to some further references if they're interested in sort of these sort of issues as well. There's both specifically how sort of COVID can be compared to the climate crisis as well, and sort of what we can learn about this. There's a professor of climate change and geography, Mike Hume, who's written a bit about this and also has recorded a few podcasts on this as well. And also on the issue of control, one of the co-authors to our paper that we've talked a lot about in this podcast already, Andy Sterling, has written some very interesting critiques of the sort of climate movement's tendency to want to control the situation rather than promote a sort of a caring approach and an emancipatory approach to changing our societies and working for a better world. And both of these people have been interviewed by Ingrid Rieser, who has a podcast called Forest of Thought. So I guess that's a sort of shout out to anybody who's interested in sort of listening more and thinking more about this. There's more to say there as well. I think one last thought on this this idea of the pandemic compared to the climate change, because I think there's a lot of differences also between the two. And that's also important to note, that there's different temporal scales, there's different levels of urgency, there's different ways in which they play out. But I think one common thing is that what we end up doing sometimes in the mode of crisis or the mode of emergency is we reduce things to much less than what they are. So for example, in the pandemic, you can see on a fundamental level, we reduce human beings to possible contagiors of the virus. So that's what they are, sort of. And we reduce life in all its myriad forms and wonderful and difficult situations to the question of survival. And we focus on death rates, which is not to say that those are important metrics and important things to look at, but we can't let that push to the side other important issues as well. And I guess in the context of climate change, there's a risk that when we reduce people to emitters of greenhouse gas emissions, we miss out on a lot of other important dimensions of what it means to live our lives as well. So
did you sort of have the chance in your discussions to rank these themes? Were you able to rank the themes or the lenses through which you are looking at the problem of why we haven't been able to, to bend the emissions curve?
In terms of which ones I think are more important or others?
Which ones have sort of have contributed more?
Well, I think they do different things, like the lenses. So they're operating on different levels and on different. Some are more specific and sort of focusing in on particular issues that are more connected directly, perhaps to carbon emissions, and others are more trying to look at the picture in a much more broader historical context. So, for example, what are the patterns of thought? What are the practices? What are the sort of that go well beyond emissions? So I think that's also a lesson, I guess. That so for me, it's hard. And of course, they come in a particular order, but that's not. You have to put them in some order when you write a text. And that's kind of an order that we thought made sense, but we could have put them in the opposite order as well. So it's not that the first one is more important than the last one, not at all. So I wouldn't want to rank them. I would say that that's up to each and every person to sort of to read through and see what speaks to them in their particular context that they're in, and their struggles, and the work that they're doing, and the things that they can feel like they can contribute to. So
I guess that each theme would sort of have its hot zones or hot spots in different regions. Of course, there will be overlaps, but I can sort of picture a global map with all the themes, in color coded, and where we sort of have the hot spots over the entire globe. But I guess that a lot of people are not going to be happy with such a map.
Well, and it might be interesting in some ways if you take it just for an exercise and not something that's true, because I think, again, the lenses that we came up with it was based on Kevin's and my perspectives. But I think, we tried to capture something that might be relevant for others as well. So, but it's not the 9 reasons why we failed to address climate change, or the 9 things we need to do to solve the climate crisis. It's definitely not that. It's a beginning of a conversation, or it's the continuation of a conversation that we thought needed to be shaken up a bit. And hopefully it will be helpful and meaningful to people that are really working with these issues in different ways, or interested to learn more about them. But yeah, if you do a map like that, I'd be happy to engage with you. It'll be interesting. And some of them it might be easier, where emissions come from, and these sort of things. So that would be much easier, of course, than. But also the centers of sort of colonial geopolitical power, these sort of things might be interesting as well. So let's chat about that.
Definitely, So for the modeling community, I think what we can see is that actually, we could do something to bring our emissions down. It's something we can see that it's possible, but then being possible and being realistic are 2 different things. And it's possible, but of course, that's why I say your conclusion really hits it. But it's something that I guess I'm hoping that future leaders, the younger generation, would pay attention to. And I'm hoping that this conversation will be carried on. I really, really hope that we will have especially more people on this podcast, talking about, in many different sectors, what lessons have we learned from the COVID? And I think that if we are very sincere, we can collect some ideas that would help us to begin to reshape things. As we talk about sort of lessons that we are learning, what we could be doing, I guess what people might be asking is, so what can I do as an individual? I might not be with the IPCC, getting a report together and showing this, and if this is really everyone's responsibility, what could I be doing? Do you have any sort of, what can you tell? We usually say the guy on the street. What have we learned from this study, and what could we be doing about it, in our own small corner?
Well, I'm not sure if you will be happy with my answer either, because I would be much more interested in listening to what they had to say than trying to communicate what we have found. But of course, if they were interested and willing to listen, which I think tends to be the case when you start by being curious, then we might get into an interesting conversation. And I've had many of those with the guy or the girl on the streets, or the so, and I think, I don't know, I think it goes back to this question and sort of the constant questioning that I'm involved with as a PhD candidate, and maybe bringing the P in PhD to the fore, and thinking about the sort of this. For me, philosophy is not something abstract. Abstraction is a part of philosophy. But I think what's important in when you abstract things, like write a paper and create some sort of narrative and some sort of analysis, is to be aware that you're abstracting.
Okay.
And be vigilant around that. What I would start with the person on the street would probably start from sort of common sense experience of things, and encourage them to engage with the so-called experts, or the enablers, as we call them in our paper. Engage with them and ask them difficult questions. And they may seem stupid questions to you, but often I think they're less stupid than you think. That's my experience, at least. And I think that don't necessarily always trust the so-called experts or enablers too much. That's not to fund. That's not to sort of emphasize that we should be funding science denial and these sort of things. But just I think we need to have an honest conversation about very difficult issues, and then it's not enough to let this or leave this to the experts at all, whoever they may be. And I think you should be especially cautious if they're self-proclaimed experts. So that would be my advice. But you're probably already aware of that if you're a guy or a girl on the street. So maybe it's unnecessary for me to say that. But I think, having said that, I think, of course, what we can maybe communicate at least is that these are urgent times as well. It's not that, so we are in all sorts of different. It's just, for me, it seems like on a very local personal scale, but also on a global scale, we are in a situation where things are sort of tipping and in all sorts of different directions. And I think where we will go will matter what every one of us does in their little context. And it's easy to think that what one does doesn't matter in the bigger scheme of things, but I think that's one of the most dangerous things to think, because I think it's been proven wrong over and over in history. So to remember that as well, that I think everybody can make a small difference, and that it can be a bigger difference than you think.
Yeah. I mean, because one of the lenses you use is lifestyles, and it's that's something that hits everyone. Wherever you are, you looking at your lifestyle, and I think we have a couple of podcasts that we discuss, things like even your clothing, because David is into waste management, and we see how there is so much waste from clothing, dumped into the seas. You have mass shipments from America into Africa, and then it's most of them are not sold or something like that, and they end up in the sea, and it's these are things that we could also be doing in our own ways. Buy clothes, if you need them. Not to be too worried about being fashionable. We are preparing the earth for our children. I hope you're okay with me saying this. You're wearing a sweater that belongs to your dad. It's in a small way. It's still part of it. It's still part of it. I came to China with some clothes that my dad gave to me back in 2009, and I still wear them. These small things, they might seem small, but I think they have very significant repercussions. If we are to get others to be a part of this, I think this would be good. It's been so good talking with you on these things and thinking about them. Why we haven't been able to bend the curve. And I wish that we could go on and on and on. As we sort of conclude this, would you like to, send any greetings to anyone, support anyone else's, vision or something like that, or, any shout outs to anyone that you want to give?
Yeah, I'm not used to doing shout outs, but and also there are so many. So I mean, if I start mentioning one, then I want to start mentioning so many more. And I guess I just like to end with saying that my experience is that my life, and I guess that's true for all of us, who are comprised of the many relations that we have, and that is what really makes us. So I'm grateful to all those relations that have and continue to constitute me, and especially maybe the ones that have made me appreciate what a mystery this life is, and the ones that I've felt a strong affinity to, and that have made me feel that I belong. But also the ones that have troubled me and sort of provided friction and another kind of meaning and purpose, and perhaps brought me down to the ground when I needed it. So yeah.
Wow, Isak, thank you so much for being with us on this podcast, for this conversation, for being a voice on GLC. Really appreciate
thanks for the opportunity. And yeah, it was really nice to engage with somebody that's read my work and then, asks really important, good questions. So thanks, Daniel.
Thank you so much for joining us in these 2 episodes of the Green Living Chat podcast and our discussions with Isak Stoddard. We hope that these episodes have been very educational to you, and we hope that they have affected your life in the way you think about our struggles with bending the global emissions curve. We look forward to your feedbacks and your comments that will help us to engage in more interesting discussions like these. A big shout out to the entire team of the Green Living Chat podcast who make sure that our episodes are published. You all rock.